In the ruins of an ancient West African kingdom, a flower grows in darkness. The Ndipaya people have protected it for generations, understanding what outsiders do not. The flower grants power to those who survive its consumption. Most people die. The few who live gain abilities beyond normal human limits. The Ndipaya built their civilization around this knowledge. They stationed warriors in the ruins to keep strangers away. They understood the flower belonged to the land it grew from, that removing it would break something fundamental. In 1966, 3 men arrived with different intentions. They came with funding, with academic credentials, with the backing of wealthy institutions. They came to take what they wanted. When the native people tried to stop them, the men treated resistance as primitive superstition standing in the way of scientific progress. After 3 months of conflict, the Europeans found the flower, extracted samples, and left. They called this discovery. The Ndipaya called it theft, and history would prove them right. This is a story about extraction, about how empires are built by taking resources from places deemed less valuable than the profit those resources generate, about how capitalism requires constant expansion into new markets, new territories, new bodies to exploit, about how corporations function as the private sector arm of imperialism, turning colonial logic into quarterly earnings. Over the next several hours, we will trace how Resident Evil constructs a systematic critique of late-stage capitalism through the lens of bioweapons development, following the Progenitor virus from West African soil to American streets, watching wealth accumulate while bodies pile up, understanding that every zombie represents someone whose life was worth less than the profit extracted from their death. If you find something in this video that resonates with you, drop a comment letting me know what part stuck with you, whether it was a specific detail, a connection you made, or just a moment that landed. You can also suggest topics for future videos. Some of the best ideas have come from you. Now get comfortable, settle in, and let's start. Chapter 1. The Stairway to the Sun. The flower had a name in Ndipaya legend, Stairway to the Sun. In German, researchers would later call it Sonnentreppe. It grew in specific conditions underground, in darkness, in humidity and temperature ranges that existed nowhere else on Earth. The flower contained a virus potentially millions of years old, capable of rewriting DNA across all forms of life, animal, plant, fungal, bacterial. The virus could reverse cell death and revive organisms that had been deceased for considerable time. No other known pathogen demonstrated these characteristics. For the Ndipaya, this was sacred knowledge passed down through generations. Consuming the flower meant death for most people. But those who survived the infection gained intelligence and physical capabilities that exceeded human limits. One Ndipaya king who survived reportedly ruled for generations. His lifespan extended far beyond what should have been possible. The survivors built the most advanced civilization in their region at that time. They understood the flower's power. They also understood its danger. The Ndipaya did not try to mass-produce the flower. They did not attempt to extract and weaponize the virus. They built religious and social structures around it, incorporated it into their understanding of the world, and protected it from outsiders who might not understand what they were dealing with. When animals consumed the flowers and mutated into what early humans would consider monsters, the Ndipaya performed rituals to contain them, built pits to trap them, stationed warriors to prevent escape. Eventually, these creatures devastated parts of the city and killed the king who had ruled for generations. The Ndipaya migrated to the marshlands, but kept soldiers in the ruins to ward off intruders. This knowledge reached European academia through 19th century British explorer Henry Travis. He documented Ndipaya religion and folklore regarding the flowers during his travels. The academic establishment discredited him. His accounts were dismissed as fabrication or exaggeration. For decades, the information sat in obscure journals and family libraries, forgotten by everyone except those looking for exactly this kind of story. Oswell Spencer was looking. Spencer came from a prestigious British aristocratic family. Born around 1923, he received the finest education wealth could purchase. He became fascinated with eugenics theory during his university years. the belief that human evolution could be artificially accelerated through selective breeding and genetic engineering. Spencer believed modern humans were imperfect, that natural evolution was too slow, that superior individuals should dominate inferior populations. He met like-minded scientists, Dr. James Marcus, a virologist, Edward Ashford, another researcher. They shared Spencer's conviction that humanity required forced evolution. Spencer found Travis's journals in his family library. The description of a flower that could alter human DNA aligned perfectly with his eugenic ambitions. If such a virus existed, it could be weaponized to create a superior race of humans. Those who survived infection would be biologically superior. Those who died would be eliminated from the gene pool. Spencer saw this as desirable. He framed it as advancing human evolution. What he was actually describing was mass murder justified by pseudo-scientific racism. In 1966, Spencer organized an expedition to West Africa with Marcus and Edward Ashford. They searched for 3 months. The Ndipaya fought to keep them away from the ruins. Spencer's team treated this resistance as an obstacle rather than a warning. They were Europeans with funding and academic authority. The Ndipaya were indigenous people protecting something that Europeans had already decided belonged to science, to progress, to whoever could extract the most value from it. The expedition found the flowers growing in the underground ruins. Marcus extracted samples immediately. Testing confirmed Spencer's hypothesis. The flowers contained a virus capable of altering DNA at a fundamental level. Marcus named it Progenitor. They collected as many samples as they could carry and left Africa. This moment is the origin point for every outbreak in the Resident Evil franchise. Every zombie, every mutation, every bioorganic weapon traces back to this extraction. Spencer and his team took a biological resource from a place where it had existed in ecological and cultural balance for potentially millions of years. They ignored the people who had developed sustainable relationships with that resource. They dismissed warnings from those who understood the dangers better than colonizers ever would. They took what they wanted because they had the power to take it, and because the Ndipaya lacked the political or military infrastructure to stop them. This is imperialism functioning exactly as designed. Find a resource in a territory where people lack the power to defend it. Extract the resource, ignore the consequences for the people who live there. Frame the extraction as progress, as science, as beneficial to humanity. Build wealth and power on the theft. Call anyone who resists primitive or backward, or standing in the way of advancement. Back in Europe, Spencer's team attempted to cultivate the flowers for mass production. The plants grew strong, they flowered quickly, but the flowers contained no virus. Something about the specific environmental conditions in West Africa triggered viral development. Temperature, humidity, soil composition, underground darkness. Whatever combination of factors was necessary could not be replicated in European laboratories. By February of 1967, cultivation attempts had completely failed. Brandon Bailey documented this in his research notes. The flowers would not produce the virus outside their origin environment. This failure should have ended the project. Instead, it made the African source infinitely more valuable. If the virus could not be mass-produced through cultivation, Umbrella would need to maintain ongoing extraction operations in Africa. They would need to develop methods to artificially culture the virus under laboratory conditions. They would need infrastructure to house research operations large enough to weaponize Progenitor on a global scale. They would need a corporation. Chapter 2: The Pharmaceutical Facade. In March of 1968, Oswell Spencer, James Marcus, and Edward Ashford founded Umbrella Pharmaceuticals. The corporate slogan was, "Preserving the Health of the People." The logo was a red and white umbrella. The symbolism was deliberate. An umbrella protects people from poisonous rain falling from above. Those standing under the umbrella survive. Those outside do not. Umbrella presented itself as a pharmaceutical company. Medicine, cosmetics, health foods, industrial equipment, consumer products. The corporation produced goods that appeared in homes across the world. People used Umbrella products daily without knowing what the company actually existed to accomplish. This was intentional. The legitimate pharmaceutical business served two purposes. First, it generated profit. real profit from real products sold to real consumers. Second, it provided cover for what Umbrella actually existed to do, weapons development. Spencer became chief executive officer. Marcus and Ashford held research positions. The corporate structure was designed to concentrate power in Spencer's hands, while distributing responsibility across enough subsidiaries and shell companies to obscure the weapons development from regulatory oversight. Umbrella had divisions for medical equipment, shipping and transport, electronics and hardware, special alloy development. Each division operated semi-independently. Each division contributed to the bioweapons program, without most employees understanding the full scope of what they were building. The corporate motto, attributed to James Marcus, was "Obedience breeds discipline, discipline breeds unity, unity breeds power, power is life." This was not marketing language. This was operational philosophy. Umbrella demanded absolute obedience from employees. Questioning orders meant termination or worse. Discipline was enforced through surveillance, through loyalty tests, through the constant threat that anyone could become expendable. Unity meant everyone working toward company goals regardless of personal ethics. Power meant Umbrella could operate above law, above regulation, above any authority except profit, and Spencer's eugenic vision. The company secured funding from powerful financial groups by presenting bioweapons development as lucrative military contracts. Governments would pay enormous sums for viral weapons that could turn enemy populations against themselves. A virus that reanimated corpses and drove them to attack the living had obvious strategic applications. Umbrella framed this as defensive. They claimed bioweapons research was necessary to counter potential biological attacks from hostile nations. They argued that developing these weapons put them in the best position to develop countermeasures and vaccines. This argument was false. Umbrella had no interest in countermeasures. They had interest in weapons that could be deployed, that could generate profits from military contracts, that could be tested on populations with minimal political consequences. The pharmaceutical facade meant Umbrella could conduct illegal experiments while maintaining plausible deniability. If an outbreak occurred, blame laboratory accidents, claim safety protocols failed, present the company as victim of unfortunate circumstances rather than architect of intentional harm. Spencer understood that capitalism rewards this kind of operation, a corporation that can externalize costs, that can make populations bear the consequences of corporate decisions while shareholders reap profits, that can present mass death as unfortunate accident rather than business model, will always outcompete ethical alternatives. Ethics are expensive. Regulations are obstacles. Human life is a cost to be minimized. Umbrella eliminated these inefficiencies by operating in territories where regulations were weak, where populations were politically powerless, where authorities could be bribed or threatened into cooperation. Raccoon City became Umbrella's primary American base of operations. The city was small enough to control, but large enough to provide workforce and infrastructure. Umbrella funded the city's police department, including the creation of the Special Tactics and Rescue Service Unit. They funded the hospital. They funded civic improvements. In return, the city government gave Umbrella free rein to construct laboratories beneath the city, to conduct research without oversight, to operate as a state within a state. The mayor took Umbrella money. The police chief, Brian Irons, was on Umbrella's payroll directly. STARS, the elite tactical unit, was funded by Umbrella. This created a system where the institution meant to protect citizens from corporate harm was actually an extension of corporate power. When Umbrella needed something investigated, STARS investigated it. When Umbrella needed something covered up, the police covered it up. When Umbrella needed test subjects, the city provided them without knowing what it was providing. This is how capitalism colonizes civic institutions. Fund the police, control law enforcement. Fund the hospital, control medical records and access to bodies for experimentation. Fund civic improvements, create dependence on corporate money that makes resistance financially impossible. Raccoon City's economy ran on Umbrella. Challenging Umbrella meant destroying the city's economic base. So nobody challenged Umbrella. City officials took the money and looked away. Back in Africa, Umbrella maintained extraction operations in the Kiuju region. They could not cultivate the progenitor virus elsewhere, which meant they needed ongoing access to the original source. The Ndipaya continued resisting. Umbrella treated this resistance as a security problem requiring military solutions. They hired private military contractors. They bribed local authorities. They established research facilities in the region and conducted experiments on local populations to test progenitor variants. The Ndipaya had protected the flower for generations because they understood the danger. Umbrella extracted it because they understood the profit. One worldview valued sustainability, cultural preservation, and ecological balance. The other valued quarterly earnings and market dominance. Guess which worldview had access to capital, to weapons, to political influence? By 1978, Umbrella had become a multinational conglomerate, with subsidiaries across dozens of industries. The pharmaceutical business generated billions. The bioweapons business generated more. Military contracts from governments seeking viral weapons created revenue streams that dwarfed consumer products. Umbrella became one of the largest corporations in the world by selling medicine to civilians and weapons to militaries, profiting from both healing and harm, maintaining the facade that these were separate operations rather than integrated parts of a business model built on exploitation. James Marcus created the T-virus by fusing progenitor with leech DNA. The T-virus reanimated dead tissue and transformed living hosts into aggressive creatures driven only by the instinct to consume. Zombies. Marcus saw this as a breakthrough. The T-virus could be deployed in enemy territory, turning populations into weapons against themselves. Infected individuals would attack the uninfected, creating exponential spread. A small initial infection could devastate an entire city within days. Spencer saw potential beyond military applications. The T-virus killed most people it infected. Those who died were, in Spencer's eugenic framework, biologically inferior. Those who survived were superior. Spencer wanted to develop a progenitor strain that could infect humanity at scale, killing the weak and enhancing the strong. The survivors would form a new superior race with Spencer positioned as their god. This was not metaphor. Spencer explicitly described his goal as achieving godhood through forced human evolution. To accomplish this, Spencer needed test subjects, thousands of them, tens of thousands. He needed to test progenitor variants on populations large enough to generate meaningful data about survival rates, mutation patterns, and enhancement characteristics. He needed populations that could be experimented on without political consequences. He needed people nobody would miss. Chapter 3: The Wesker Children. Between the late 1960s and early 1980s, children began disappearing from orphanages, foster systems, and impoverished communities across the world. The disappearances were scattered enough to avoid pattern recognition. One child here, two children there. Different countries, different continents, different circumstances. Authorities investigated some cases, most went uninvestigated. These were children from the margins, from places where a missing child barely registered as worth the paperwork. Umbrella was taking them. Project W, also called the Wesker Plan, was a eugenics program designed to create a superior human through viral infection. Spencer understood that the progenitor virus killed most people it infected. He needed subjects with the genetic characteristics most likely to survive infection and gain superhuman abilities. He needed subjects young enough to be shaped ideologically before infection, to ensure survivors would share his eugenic worldview and serve Umbrella's interests. Umbrella identified children with superior intelligence and physical capabilities. They kidnapped them through various means. Some children were legally adopted through front organizations. Others were taken from orphanages that received umbrella funding in exchange for access to children. Some were simply abducted from communities where nobody had the resources to search for them. The children were given the surname Wesker and placed with families that had been paid to raise them according to specific protocols. These families were not told the children would be infected with experimental viruses. They were told they were participating in an elite education program for gifted children. The children received the finest education money could buy. They were trained in multiple disciplines. They were taught to believe in Spencer's philosophy of genetic superiority. They were raised to see themselves as special, as destined for greatness, as fundamentally different from ordinary humans. The children did not know they were test subjects. Project W had narrowed its focus to 13 children deemed the best candidates for viral infection. These 13 represented the top tier from hundreds of Wesker children distributed globally. Umbrella infected them through various methods. Some were manipulated into medical checkups, where they received injections they believed were vaccines. Others were infected through intermediaries, through friends who had been compromised, through circumstances engineered to seem accidental. 11 of the 13 children died from the infection. One survived, Albert Wesker. Albert gained superhuman strength, speed, and regenerative capabilities. His intelligence increased. His physical abilities exceeded human limits. He became exactly what Spencer wanted to create, a superior human forged through viral infection and eugenic selection. Alex Wesker survived the infection but gained no superhuman abilities. She suffered from a terminal degenerative disease at the time of infection, which interfered with the virus's effects. She remained convinced that infecting more subjects would increase their success rate. Spencer disagreed. He had his 2 survivors. He had proof the concept worked. Further testing would continue, but Project W had accomplished its primary goal. Albert Wesker did not learn the truth about his origins for years. He believed he was special, that his abilities came from natural superiority rather than being the sole survivor of a eugenics program that murdered 11 other children to create him. When he finally learned what Spencer had done, his response was not horror, it was anger that he had been used. Wesker embraced Spencer's eugenic philosophy completely. He simply wanted to be the god rather than the tool. Project W reveals how capitalism treats human beings as raw materials in production processes. Umbrella needed test subjects to develop progenitor variants. Children were the cheapest, most accessible raw materials available. Nobody would investigate their disappearances thoroughly. Nobody would demand accountability. The children had no political power, no families with resources to search for them, no institutions protecting their interests. Umbrella took them, used them, and discarded the failures without consequence. The 2 survivors were kept alive because they demonstrated successful mutations. They were valuable. The 11 who died were waste products. Their deaths generated data about which genetic characteristics correlated with survival, which made their deaths useful to Umbrella even if the children themselves were not. This is industrial-scale child exploitation dressed as scientific research. The Wesker children were not volunteers. They were not informed participants. They were resources extracted from vulnerable populations and processed through an experimental protocol that had an 85% mortality rate. Umbrella knew the mortality rate. They proceeded anyway. The children's lives were worth less than the data their deaths would generate. Consider what this means about corporate priorities. Umbrella could have tested progenitor variants on willing adult volunteers with informed consent. They could have developed the virus slowly, carefully, ethically. They chose not to. Ethical protocols were inefficient. Informed consent meant subjects could refuse. Adult volunteers might have families who would demand answers if something went wrong. Children from orphanages and foster systems had none of these protections. They were efficient test subjects. The Wesker plan also reveals Spencer's eugenic ideology in its purest form. He was not trying to enhance all humanity. He was trying to create a superior race by killing everyone who failed to meet his genetic standards. The test was viral infection. Those who survived were superior. Those who died deserved to die because they were biologically inferior. This is social Darwinism weaponized at a cellular level. Natural selection accelerated through artificial means. Spencer believed this was progressive. He framed forced evolution as the next stage of human development. What he was actually describing was genocide. Kill everyone who does not survive infection. Call the survivors superior. Position yourself as God over the superior race. Use corporate infrastructure to conduct the killing at scale. Use pharmaceutical facade to avoid regulatory oversight. Use wealth to ensure nobody with power to stop you has incentive to do so. Albert Wesker carried this ideology into his own plans. After Spencer's death, Wesker attempted to deploy a global bioweapon. The virus was designed to kill most of humanity and enhance the survivors. Wesker intended to rule over the new superior race as their god. He called this evolution. What he was planning was mass murder. The fact that he saw no distinction between evolution and mass murder reveals how thoroughly Spencer's eugenic framework had colonized his thinking. Wesker's worldview came directly from being raised as a Wesker child, educated in Spencer's philosophy, infected with a virus that killed his peers, and positioned as proof that genetic superiority was real and measurable through survival. He was the product of a system designed to create people who believed this. The system worked perfectly. Wesker became exactly what Spencer wanted, a superior human who embraced eugenics completely and pursued godhood through viral genocide. The horror of the Wesker plan is not that it failed. The horror is that it succeeded. Spencer wanted to create superior humans who shared his values. He created two of them. They went on to cause catastrophic harm because they were designed to believe causing catastrophic harm was evolutionary progress. Project W was not a cautionary tale about science gone wrong. It was science functioning exactly as intended within a system that valued genetic superiority over human life. Chapter 4: The Mansion Incident. In July of 1998, hikers began disappearing in the Arkway Mountains outside Raccoon City. Bodies turned up partially consumed, with bite marks that did not match any known animal. Local residents reported being attacked by what they described as diseased people who moved with strange, shambling gaits and showed no response to pain. The attacks increased in frequency. The Raccoon City Police Department could not solve the cases. The Special Tactics and Rescue Service took over the investigation. STARS was an elite law enforcement unit operating within the Raccoon City Police Department. The irony was structural. Umbrella created the problem, then funded the investigation into the problem, ensuring that investigators would be people Umbrella could control. The STARS captain was Albert Wesker, Umbrella's test subject. Spencer's success story, the man who had survived Project W. Wesker knew exactly what was happening in the Arkway Mountains. Umbrella's research facility beneath the Spencer mansion had suffered a viral outbreak. Test subjects had escaped. Bioorganic weapons were loose in the forest. The attacks on hikers and residents were infected creatures hunting for food. Umbrella needed the situation contained before authorities outside their control began investigating. They also saw an opportunity. STARS could be used as test subjects for Umbrella's Tyrant bioweapon program. On the night of July 23rd, STARS Bravo team was dispatched to investigate the murders in the Arkway Mountains. The helicopter lost contact with headquarters shortly after deployment. The next night, July 24th, STARS Alpha team was sent to find Bravo team. Wesker led the mission personally. He brought his best people. Chris Redfield, marksman. Jill Valentine, specialist in lockpicking and explosives. Barry Burton, weapons expert. Brad Vickers, helicopter pilot. Wesker had orders from Umbrella. Lead STARS into the mansion. Allow them to encounter bioorganic weapons. Monitor their performance against the creatures. Collect combat data on how effectively trained law enforcement could survive encounters with Umbrella's products. The helicopter pilot was instructed to leave Alpha Team stranded so they could not escape. Barry Burton was being blackmailed. Wesker had convinced Burton that Umbrella was holding his family hostage. Burton's cooperation was secured through threats to his wife and children. Umbrella was not actually holding anyone hostage, but Burton did not know that. Alpha Team found Bravo Team's helicopter crashed in the forest. While investigating, they were attacked by infected dogs, Cerberus units. Dogs exposed to T-virus transformed into aggressive hunters with exposed muscle tissue and enhanced speed. The dogs killed one STARS member immediately. The survivors ran. They found the Spencer mansion and took shelter inside. The mansion was filled with infected humans, zombies, former Umbrella researchers who had been exposed to T-virus when the facility's containment failed. The zombies were slow but persistent, driven entirely by the urge to consume living flesh. STARS members quickly realized ammunition was scarce. The mansion was enormous, filled with puzzles and locked doors. Escape required finding keys, solving elaborate mechanisms, and navigating a structure designed to confuse anyone unfamiliar with its layout. What STARS did not know was that this was intentional. Umbrella was testing them. How long could they survive? How would they respond to resource scarcity? Would they work together or fracture under pressure? What weapons would they improvise? How effectively could they neutralize bioorganic weapons without military training? Every decision they made was being monitored. Every encounter with infected creatures generated data Umbrella would use to refine their bioweapons. STARS discovered the underground research facility beneath the mansion. They found evidence of human experimentation. They found documentation of T-virus development. They learned that Umbrella, the pharmaceutical corporation funding their own salaries, had created the outbreak deliberately. They were not investigating murders. They were test subjects in a combat effectiveness study. Wesker revealed his true allegiance during the mission. He attempted to use STARS members to gather specific data Umbrella needed, then planned to leave them to die in the mansion when the self-destruct sequence activated. His plan failed. Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine survived. They escaped the mansion. Barry Burton survived after realizing Wesker had lied about his family being in danger. Rebecca Chambers, a Bravo team medic, also escaped. These survivors became Umbrella's most persistent enemies. They spent the next decade trying to expose the corporation, trying to convince authorities that Umbrella was conducting illegal bioweapons research, trying to hold Spencer accountable for the deaths in Arklay Mountains. Nobody with institutional power listened. Umbrella had too much influence, too much money, too many connections to government and military contracts. The survivors were police officers making accusations against a multinational pharmaceutical conglomerate. Their testimony was dismissed as post-traumatic stress or conspiracy theory. The mansion incident reveals how capitalism treats workers as disposable. STARS members were employees. Their salaries were paid by Umbrella. From Umbrella's perspective, they had already purchased STARS members' labor and lives. Using them as test subjects was simply extracting additional value from assets the company had already acquired. The fact that STARS members thought they were police officers protecting the public was irrelevant. They were resources owned by Umbrella, deployed as Umbrella saw fit. Brian Irons, Raccoon City's police chief, was on Umbrella's payroll directly. He buried the survivors' reports. He prevented investigation into the mansion incident. He ensured no evidence reached federal authorities who might have jurisdiction Umbrella could not control. Irons received payment for this obstruction. The police department meant to protect Raccoon City's citizens was actively suppressing evidence that would have exposed the danger Umbrella posed to those citizens. This is regulatory capture. When corporations gain control over the institutions meant to regulate them, those institutions become extensions of corporate power rather than checks against it. Raccoon City's police department existed to protect Umbrella's interests, not to protect Raccoon City's residents. The mayor took Umbrella money. The police chief took Umbrella money. STARS was funded by Umbrella money. Every civic institution that should have protected people from corporate harm had been purchased. What happened in the Arklay Mountains was not an accident. It was an experiment. Umbrella deliberately released bioorganic weapons. They deliberately sent STARS into a contaminated zone. They deliberately monitored the results. The deaths were data points. The survivors were failures in the experimental design because Umbrella had wanted no survivors. 4 people escaping meant the bioweapons needed refinement. The Tyrant program had not been effective enough to guarantee 0 survivors against trained law enforcement personnel. Umbrella took this data and improved their products. The next iteration would be more lethal, harder to escape, more effective at eliminating witnesses. This is how capitalism incentivizes harm. Umbrella's bioweapons were products in a marketplace. Military buyers wanted weapons that could guarantee total elimination of enemy combatants. Umbrella needed to demonstrate their products met those specifications. STARS members were product testing. Their survival was a quality control failure that required addressing in the next development cycle. Chapter 5: The Raccoon City Outbreak. Dr. William Birkin worked in Umbrella's underground laboratory beneath Raccoon City. Nest, The facility was enormous, reaching down to at least 8 levels below ground. Birkin had been with Umbrella since he was a teenager. He and Wesker had trained together under James Marcus. Both had been involved in Marcus's assassination, ordered by Spencer to steal Marcus's research. Birkin had been officially credited with creating the T-virus, though the work was actually Marcus's. Umbrella rewarded loyal employees who were willing to betray colleagues for corporate advancement. Birkin's major achievement was the G-virus, where T-virus created mindless zombies. G-virus created something more dangerous. Hosts could mutate continuously, developing new biological features in response to damage. They could regenerate from catastrophic injuries. They retained enough intelligence to pursue specific goals rather than simply attacking whatever was nearest. G-virus represented a significant advancement in bioweapons technology. Umbrella wanted the G-virus. Birkin wanted credit and compensation. Negotiations broke down. In September of 1998, Umbrella sent the Umbrella Security Service into Nest to seize Birkin's research by force. The USS was Umbrella's private military. They handled security operations, hostage situations, and internal enforcement. When Umbrella needed someone eliminated, the USS handled it. The USS team shot Birkin multiple times and stole his G-virus samples. Birkin, dying, injected himself with G-virus. The transformation saved his life but turned him into exactly the kind of monster he had been creating. G. Birkin was massive, powerful, and driven by an instinct to implant embryos in compatible hosts to reproduce. He pursued the USS team through the sewers beneath Raccoon City. During the fight, T-virus samples were damaged and spilled into the sewer system. Rats drank the contaminated water. The rats became infected. Infected rats spread throughout Raccoon City's sewer network, infecting more rats, contaminating the water supply. Within days, Raccoon City residents began showing symptoms. The city's media, controlled by Umbrella's influence, claimed a new strain of flu was moving through the population. Authorities implemented quarantine protocols. The real nature of the infection was suppressed. By late September, Raccoon City was experiencing full outbreak. Zombies filled the streets. The police department was overwhelmed. Most officers died in the initial chaos. Civilians trapped in their homes were eaten by infected neighbors. The city descended into hell within 48 hours. Umbrella's response was not to contain the outbreak. It was to gather data. The corporation deployed monitoring teams into Raccoon City to observe how the T-virus spread in an urban environment. They wanted information on transmission rates, mutation patterns, and bioorganic weapon effectiveness against civilian populations. Raccoon City became a live testing ground with over 100,000 unwilling participants. Umbrella also sent teams to eliminate survivors. The corporation deployed Nemesis, a Tyrant-class bioweapon, specifically to hunt down STARS members who were in the city. Jill Valentine was in Raccoon City when the outbreak occurred. Nemesis pursued her relentlessly, demonstrating that Umbrella was using the outbreak as an opportunity to field test advanced bioweapons while simultaneously eliminating witnesses from the mansion incident. Leon Kennedy arrived in Raccoon City on September 29th, his first day on the job. He encountered Claire Redfield, sister of STARS member Chris Redfield. Claire was searching for her brother. Together they navigated the infected city, eventually reaching the police department and then Nest. They fought G. Birkin multiple times as he mutated into increasingly grotesque forms. They escaped the facility before it self-destructed. The United States government decided to sterilize Raccoon City. On October 1st at dawn, the military fired a missile into the city center. The explosion incinerated everything within the blast radius. The heat was intense enough to neutralize the T-virus. Buildings collapsed. Fires consumed what remained. By sunrise, Raccoon City no longer existed. Over 100,000 people died in the blast. The government framed this as necessary containment. They claimed the virus could not be allowed to spread beyond Raccoon City. This was partially true. The virus was spreading, but the decision to destroy an entire American city with its own citizens still trapped inside reveals how governments prioritize property and stability over human life. When corporate interests are threatened, Umbrella faced no criminal consequences for causing the outbreak. The corporation's influence extended into federal government. Military contracts, campaign contributions, lobbying, revolving door employment between umbrella and regulatory agencies. All of this insulated Umbrella from accountability. The survivors who tried to expose Umbrella's responsibility were discredited. The official narrative blamed the outbreak on industrial accident or possibly domestic terrorism. Umbrella was positioned as victim rather than perpetrator. Raccoon City's destruction demonstrates how capitalism externalizes costs onto populations without power to refuse. Umbrella created the virus. Umbrella's employee caused the outbreak through corporate espionage gone wrong. Umbrella's products killed over 100,000 people. But Umbrella did not pay for any of this. The cost was borne by Raccoon City residents who were turned into zombies, by survivors who lost everything, by taxpayers who funded the military operation that destroyed the city. Umbrella extracted profit from bioweapons development. Raccoon City absorbed the consequences. This is standard corporate practice taken to its extreme. Pollute the environment, let communities deal with contamination. Exploit workers, let social services handle the poverty. Develop bioweapons, let entire cities burn when the products escape containment. Profit is private. Consequences are public. The outbreak also reveals Umbrella's willingness to turn disaster into opportunity. They did not try to stop the outbreak. They monitored it. They gathered data. They tested products. An entire city dying was useful to them because it provided real-world combat data that laboratory testing could never replicate. Over 100,000 people became test subjects without consent, without compensation, without even knowing they were being used to generate data for a corporation's product development. This is human experimentation at unprecedented scale. Raccoon City residents were not volunteers. They were not informed participants. They were raw materials in an experiment designed to produce marketable intelligence about viral transmission in urban environments. Their deaths served Umbrella's business interests. The fact that their deaths also served as cover for eliminating STAR's survivors made them doubly useful. Consider the layers of exploitation here. Umbrella took a virus from West Africa. They weaponized it in American laboratories. They tested it on kidnapped children. They deployed it against their own employees when those employees became inconvenient. They allowed it to spread through an American city to gather combat data. They profited from every stage of this process. The wealth accumulated. The bodies piled up. Nobody with institutional power intervened because Umbrella had purchased that institutional power through the normal mechanisms capitalism provides. Chapter 6: Imperialism as Business Model. Umbrella's operations in Africa continued throughout the corporation's existence. The Progenitor virus could only be sourced from West Africa. Attempts to cultivate it elsewhere had failed. This meant Umbrella needed permanent presence in the region to maintain extraction operations. They established research facilities in Kijuju. They conducted experiments on local populations without consent or compensation. The parallels to historical colonialism are precise. European powers extracted resources from Africa for centuries. Gold, diamonds, rubber, ivory, human beings sold into slavery. The extraction enriched European nations while impoverishing African communities. Colonial powers justified this through racial pseudoscience, claiming Africans were inferior and needed European civilization. Violence was used to suppress resistance. Local governance was replaced with colonial administration that served extraction rather than local welfare. Umbrella replicated this model exactly. Extract biological resources from Africa. Enrich the corporation while destroying local communities. Justify the extraction through eugenic pseudoscience claiming genetic superiority. Use private military force to suppress resistance. Replace local authority with corporate control that serves profit rather than community welfare. The difference is time frame and explicit acknowledgement. Historical colonialism occurred over centuries and was openly defended as civilizing mission. Corporate imperialism occurs in decades and is framed as economic development or scientific progress. The mechanics are identical. The outcomes are identical. Only the language changes. Umbrella's presence in these African regions caused catastrophic harm to the communities there. The corporations' experiments infected local populations. People died or mutated into bioorganic weapons. The Ndipaya people, who had protected the progenitor flowers for generations, were displaced from their ancestral lands. Umbrella treated them as obstacles to resource extraction, rather than as people with legitimate claims to their own territory. When Umbrella eventually collapsed in 2003, the damage persisted. The research facilities were abandoned, but not decommissioned. Contaminated materials were left in place. The region became a hotspot for bioterrorism as other organizations moved in to salvage Umbrella's research. By 2009, when Chris Redfield and Shiva Alamar investigated bioterrorism in Kyushu for the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance, they found the region devastated by decades of exploitation. This is the long-term consequence of extraction-based imperialism. Resources are taken, wealth flows out of the region, environmental and social damage remains. When the extraction ends, companies abandon the territory without remediation. Communities are left with contaminated land, disrupted social structures, and no compensation for what was taken. This pattern repeats across every region where imperial powers or multinational corporations have operated. Consider how this connects to real-world pharmaceutical corporations. The global pharmaceutical industry frequently conducts drug trials in developing nations where regulatory oversight is weaker and populations are desperate enough to participate in experiments they might refuse elsewhere. These trials generate data that benefits wealthy populations in developed nations while exposing participants in developing nations to risks without guarantee of access to the treatments being tested. The Tuskegee syphilis study conducted by the United States Public Health Service from 1932 to 1972 exemplifies this dynamic within America itself. Researchers studied untreated syphilis in black men in Alabama. The men were told they were receiving free health care. They were not told they had syphilis. They were not treated even after penicillin became available as a cure. Researchers wanted data on how syphilis progressed without treatment. The men's health was subordinated to research objectives. Their suffering generated knowledge that benefited medical science while destroying their lives. Umbrella's experiments function identically. Find populations without power to refuse. Conduct experiments that benefit corporate interests while harming participants. Frame the harm as necessary for progress. Ensure participants cannot access the benefits their suffering produces. This is not aberrant behavior by rogue corporations. This is standard practice within systems that value profit over human welfare. The pharmaceutical industry's approach to global health demonstrates this clearly. Companies develop drugs that treat diseases common in wealthy nations because wealthy patients can pay premium prices. Diseases that primarily affect poor populations receive minimal research investment because poor patients cannot generate profits. Malaria, tuberculosis, and parasitic diseases kill millions annually, but attract far less pharmaceutical investment than erectile dysfunction or cosmetic treatments because the market rewards serving wealthy customers regardless of medical need. Umbrella took this logic to its extreme, developed bioweapons for military buyers who can pay enormous sums, test them on populations who cannot refuse or resist, extract maximum profit while externalizing all costs onto communities without political power to demand accountability. The scale and brutality are exceptional, but the underlying mechanics are standard capitalism functioning without regulatory constraint. Spencer's eugenic philosophy provided ideological justification for this extraction. If certain populations are genetically inferior, their suffering in service of advancing superior populations is not morally problematic. It is natural selection accelerated through artificial means. This is social Darwinism weaponized at corporate scale. The same ideology that justified historical colonialism, slavery, and genocide is repackaged as cutting-edge science and deployed through pharmaceutical corporations rather than colonial governments. The shift from government-led colonialism to corporate-led extraction is significant. Governments can be held accountable through democratic processes, at least theoretically. Corporations are accountable only to shareholders. Their legal mandate is profit maximization. Ethical considerations are relevant only insofar as they affect profitability. A corporation that can profit from harm while avoiding legal consequences will do so because that is what corporate structure incentivizes. Umbrella faced minimal consequences for decades of harm because they had purchased institutional power through normal capitalist mechanisms, campaign contributions, lobbying, regulatory capture, revolving door employment. These are legal methods corporations use to ensure laws serve corporate interests rather than constrain them. When regulations threaten profits, corporations change regulations through political influence. When authorities investigate corporate harm, corporations deploy legal teams and public relations firms to obscure evidence and discredit critics. This is not conspiracy. This is openly acknowledged corporate practice. Businesses lobby to shape policy. Corporations fund political campaigns. Industry groups write regulatory frameworks that govern their own behavior. Former corporate executives move into regulatory positions and vice versa. The mechanisms are transparent. The outcomes are predictable. Corporate power grows while civic institutions meant to constrain that power become extensions of it. Chapter 7: The Laboratory State. Between 1937 and 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army operated a covert research program in occupied Manchuria, Unit 731. The official designation was Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. The actual purpose was biological weapons development through human experimentation. Researchers infected prisoners with plague, cholera, anthrax, and other pathogens to study disease progression. They performed vivisections without anesthesia to observe how infections damaged internal organs while subjects were still alive. They tested frostbite resistance by forcing prisoners into freezing conditions, then thawing frozen limbs using different methods to determine which caused the most tissue damage. The prisoners were called logs in official documentation, not people. Logs, resources to be processed. Unit 731 processed approximately 3,000 logs during its operation. Most were Chinese civilians. Some were Soviet prisoners of war. Some were Koreans, Mongolians, or other occupied peoples. Children were included in experiments. Pregnant women were infected to study vertical disease transmission from mother to fetus. The research produced extensive data on biological weapons effectiveness, disease progression, and human physiological limits under extreme conditions. After Japan's surrender in 1945, Unit 731 researchers destroyed evidence and fled. The United States granted immunity to Unit 731 leadership in exchange for access to their experimental data. No prosecutions occurred at Tokyo war crimes tribunals. The research was classified. The data was integrated into American biological weapons programs. Between 1933 and 1945, Nazi Germany conducted medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners. Dr. Josef Mengele performed experiments on twins at Auschwitz, attempting to identify genetic factors that could be manipulated to produce racially superior offspring. Dr. Sigmund Rascher conducted high-altitude experiments, placing prisoners in low-pressure chambers to simulate conditions pilots experienced at extreme altitudes, then observing how long subjects survived before losing consciousness or dying. Freezing experiments submerged prisoners in ice water to study hypothermia and test revival methods. Bone, muscle, and nerve transplant experiments involved removing tissue from healthy prisoners and grafting it onto wounded German soldiers without anesthesia. These experiments produced data. Some of that data was scientifically useful. The question of whether such data should be used has troubled medical ethics for decades. The data was obtained through torture. The subjects did not consent. The experiments were conducted within institutional frameworks that classified certain populations as subhuman and therefore suitable for experimentation that would never be conducted on populations deemed fully human. This is the laboratory state. When governments or institutions gain power to categorize certain populations as less than human, those populations become raw materials for projects that serve institutional interests. The categorization requires ideological justification. For Imperial Japan, The justification was racial superiority and imperial expansion. For Nazi Germany, the justification was eugenics and racial purity. For Umbrella Corporation, the justification was genetic superiority and forced human evolution. The mechanics are identical across all three cases. Identify a population without power to resist, develop an ideology that justifies treating them as experimental subjects rather than people, build institutional infrastructure that enables experimentation at scale, extract maximum value through systematic harm, destroy evidence when operations become politically inconvenient. Umbrella's experimentation on the Wesker children follows this pattern precisely. Children from marginalized communities were identified as suitable test subjects because they lacked institutional protection. Eugenic ideology justified infecting them with lethal viruses by claiming genetic superiority could be identified through survival. Corporate infrastructure enabled kidnapping, indoctrination, and infection at scale across multiple countries. Resistance was impossible because the children did not know they were test subjects until infection occurred. Maximum value was extracted through an experimental protocol with 85% mortality rate. Evidence was suppressed through Umbrella's control over regulatory institutions. The difference between Umbrella and historical examples is primarily setting. Unit 731 operated under military authority during wartime occupation. Nazi experiments occurred in concentration camps during genocidal regime. Umbrella operated through corporate structure during peacetime capitalism. The ideological justifications differed in specifics while maintaining the same fundamental claim that certain populations were biologically inferior and therefore suitable for experiments that would constitute crimes if performed on superior populations. This reveals something crucial about how institutional violence functions. The specific ideology matters less than the institutional capacity to implement that ideology through systematic harm. Unit 731 required military infrastructure and occupied territory. Nazi experiments required concentration camps and totalitarian state power. Umbrella required corporate subsidiaries and regulatory capture. Different institutional forms enable the same fundamental practices: categorize populations, extract value through harm, suppress accountability. Consider how this connects to pharmaceutical research practices in the 20th century. The Tuskegee syphilis study was not an aberration. It was part of a broader pattern of medical research conducted on populations considered expendable. Between 1956 and 1970, the United States government conducted radiation experiments on prisoners, hospital patients, and military personnel without informed consent. Subjects were exposed to plutonium injections, full-body radiation, and radioactive isotopes to study effects on human physiology. The research served nuclear weapons development and radiation medicine. The subjects were disproportionately poor, black, incarcerated, or otherwise marginalized. Between 1953 and 1973, the CIA conducted Project MK-Ultra, testing mind control and interrogation techniques through experiments on unwitting subjects. Researchers administered LSD and other drugs without consent, sometimes to mental patients, sometimes to prisoners, sometimes to civilians who had no idea they were being dosed. The goal was developing interrogation methods and psychological warfare capabilities. The experiments caused permanent psychological damage to unknown numbers of subjects. When congressional investigations loomed in 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered MK-Ultra files destroyed. Most documentation was lost. These are not historical curiosities. They are examples of how institutions with sufficient power will conduct experiments on populations without that power when institutional objectives are prioritized over human welfare. The Nuremberg Code, established in 1947 in response to Nazi experiments, defined ethical principles for human experimentation: voluntary informed consent, freedom to withdraw, minimization of harm, experiments justified only by anticipated humanitarian benefit. These principles were established precisely because institutional research had demonstrated what happens without them. Yet violations continued. The Nuremberg Code had no enforcement mechanisms. It was aspirational guidance, rather than binding law. Institutions that could benefit from unethical experiments simply ignored the code when convenient. The United States continued radiation experiments 2 decades after Nuremberg. The Tuskegee study continued 2 decades after Nuremberg. Pharmaceutical companies continued conducting drug trials in developing nations with inadequate consent protocols decades after Nuremberg. Umbrella's experimentation represents this pattern taken to its logical extreme within a capitalist framework. If corporations can profit from experiments on populations without power to refuse, and if regulatory institutions have been captured to prevent oversight, then corporations will conduct those experiments at whatever scale generates maximum profit. The only constraint is public exposure severe enough to threaten profitability through reputational damage or legal consequences. Raccoon City demonstrates what happens when that constraint fails. Over 100,000 people were used as test subjects in viral transmission experiments without consent. The outbreak was not contained because Umbrella wanted data. The corporation monitored how quickly the virus spread through an urban environment, which populations showed resistance, how different strains affected transmission rates, how bioorganic weapons performed against civilian populations. Every death generated data points. Every mutation provided research material. The entire city became a laboratory. This is medical experimentation at unprecedented scale, conducted not by military or government, but by a private corporation pursuing profit through bioweapons development. The scale exceeded anything Unit 731 attempted by orders of magnitude. The methodology was identical. Turn human beings into experimental subjects without consent, monitor results, extract data, suppress evidence. The fact that Umbrella did this through corporate channels rather than military occupation does not change the fundamental nature of what occurred. The government's decision to destroy Raccoon City reveals complicity at institutional level. Military leadership knew Umbrella had caused the outbreak. They chose sterilization over investigation because investigation would expose Umbrella's operations, which would expose government contracts with Umbrella for bioweapons development, which would reveal that the United States government was funding the same kind of research that had been condemned at Nuremberg. Destroying the city destroyed the evidence, killing survivors eliminated witnesses, framing it as necessary containment provided cover for what was actually systematic evidence destruction. This is how institutional violence protects itself. When exposure threatens powerful institutions, those institutions will sacrifice populations without institutional power to prevent accountability. Raccoon City residents had no power. They were expendable. Umbrella had power through wealth and government contracts. The corporation was protected. The population was eliminated. This is not aberrant behavior by rogue elements. This is institutions functioning as designed when protecting institutional interests conflicts with protecting human life. Chapter 8. The Profit Motive. Umbrella collapsed in 2004. Not because of criminal prosecution, not because of regulatory intervention, because the corporation's market position became untenable after too many public failures. The Raccoon City incident damaged Umbrella's reputation enough that military buyers began contracting with competitors. Stock prices fell. Investors withdrew. The corporation filed for bankruptcy. During liquidation, Umbrella's research was not destroyed, it was sold. Virus samples, experimental data, bioorganic weapon designs, research methodologies, all of this became available on black markets to whoever could pay. Former Umbrella researchers found employment with other organizations pursuing bioweapons development. The knowledge dispersed rather than disappearing. This created what Resident Evil's later games called the Age of Bioterrorism. Without Umbrella's monopoly on bioweapons research, dozens of smaller organizations entered the market. Some were corporations seeking military contracts. Some were terrorist organizations seeking weapons for ideological goals. Some were rogue nations pursuing strategic advantages. The viruses Umbrella developed became available to anyone with sufficient funding and lack of ethical constraints. By 2009, bioterrorism had become a global crisis requiring international response. The Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance was formed to combat bioorganic weapon proliferation. Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine, survivors of the Mansion incident, joined BSAA to continue fighting the threat Umbrella had created. They spent years tracking down black market virus dealers, neutralizing bioorganic weapons, and preventing outbreaks that would have killed thousands. This demonstrates how capitalism handles institutional collapse. When a corporation fails, its assets are liquidated and redistributed. If those assets are dangerous, that danger is redistributed along with them. No mechanism exists to destroy dangerous corporate assets during liquidation, because doing so would reduce asset value. Maximizing value for creditors and shareholders takes precedence over public safety, so Umbrella's viruses were sold to the highest bidders regardless of what those bidders intended to do with them. The parallel to weapons manufacturing is precise. When defense contractors develop new weapons, those weapons eventually become available to whoever can purchase them, either through legal arms sales or black market proliferation. The original manufacturer profits from initial development and sale. Secondary markets profit from resale and distribution. End users deploy the weapons for whatever purposes serve their interests. The harm caused is externalized onto populations where weapons are deployed. Umbrella developed bioweapons. Umbrella profited from military contracts. Umbrella collapsed. The bioweapons proliferated. Terrorist organizations deployed them. Civilian populations died in outbreaks. The cost was borne by people who had no involvement in bioweapons development, no choice about whether such weapons should exist, no power to prevent their use. This is standard externalization of costs within capitalist systems. Consider the pharmaceutical industry's approach to opioid medications. Companies developed powerful painkillers. They marketed them aggressively to doctors, downplaying addiction risks. Patients became addicted. The addiction crisis killed hundreds of thousands. Companies profited enormously during initial sales. When the crisis became undeniable, companies faced lawsuits and settlements, but the settlements were structured to allow companies to continue operating while distributing costs across communities devastated by the crisis. Wealth flowed upward during profit generation. Costs flowed downward during crisis response. Umbrella followed this pattern. Profits from bioweapon sales enriched Spencer, shareholders, and executives. Costs from outbreaks, experiments, and proliferation were borne by test subjects, Raccoon City residents, and populations affected by bioterrorism after Umbrella's collapse. The people who profited were not the people who paid the costs. This asymmetry is fundamental to how extraction-based capitalism functions. The age of bioterrorism also reveals how corporate harm persists beyond corporate existence. Umbrella's collapse did not end the threat Umbrella created. It dispersed the threat across more actors with less centralized control. Fighting bioorganic weapons required international cooperation, substantial funding, and ongoing military operations. The cost of containing Umbrella's legacy exceeded the profits Umbrella generated, but the profits went to private shareholders while containment costs were borne by governments funded through public taxation. This is privatized profit and socialized cost at civilizational scale. Umbrella extracted profit from bioweapons development. Society absorbed the cost of preventing those bioweapons from causing extinction-level outbreaks. The corporation internalized gains while externalizing existential risks. When the corporation collapsed, the risks remained, while the gains had already been distributed to shareholders who bore no responsibility for managing those risks. Albert Wesker's attempt to deploy Ouroboros in 2009 demonstrates how thoroughly Spencer's ideology had proliferated. Wesker was not working for Umbrella at that point. He was operating independently with his own resources and his own goals, but his ideology came directly from Spencer's eugenic framework: kill the weak through viral infection. Position yourself as God over the superior survivors. Wesker had internalized this completely. He pursued it even after Umbrella's collapse because the ideology did not depend on corporate infrastructure. This reveals an important distinction. Institutions enable systematic harm at scale, but ideologies persist beyond institutions. Spencer's eugenic beliefs shaped Umbrella's operations for decades. When Umbrella collapsed, the beliefs did not disappear. They had been transmitted to people like Wesker who carried them forward into new contexts. Defeating Umbrella did not defeat the worldview that created Umbrella. That worldview continues seeking new institutional forms to implement itself. The pharmaceutical industry's eugenic history provides real-world parallel. In the early 20th century, eugenics was mainstream scientific consensus in Western nations. Forced sterilization laws targeted people deemed genetically inferior. Immigration restrictions prevented certain ethnic groups from entering countries based on claims of biological unsuitability. These policies were developed and defended by leading scientists, physicians, and public health officials. The ideology had institutional support across medicine, academia, and government. Nazi Germany's genocidal application of eugenics discredited the explicit ideology after 1945, but the underlying assumptions persisted in modified forms. IQ testing continued to be used to justify racial hierarchies. Genetic screening programs targeted populations deemed at risk for hereditary diseases. Reproductive technologies were marketed in ways that encouraged selection for socially desirable traits. The language changed, but the core belief that certain genetic profiles were superior to others maintained institutional presence. Umbrella's eugenics was Spencer's personal ideology implemented through corporate power. But eugenics had been mainstream institutional ideology for decades before Spencer founded Umbrella. He was not inventing new ideas. He was taking existing ideas about genetic superiority and forced evolution and applying them through bioweapons development rather than through state policy. The innovation was methodological, not ideological. This matters because defeating individual corporations does not address the systemic conditions that enable them. Spencer died in 2009, killed by Wesker. Umbrella collapsed in 2004. But bioterrorism proliferated because the market incentives for bioweapons development persisted. Other corporations, other researchers, other military programs continued pursuing the same technologies through similar methods because the underlying economic and political structures that rewarded such development remained intact. Chapter 9: The Cost of Bodies. By 2026, approximately 3 decades after the Mansion incident, the death toll from Umbrella-created viruses exceeds several million people. Raccoon City alone accounts for over 100,000. Outbreaks in other locations add hundreds of thousands more. Bioterrorist attacks using Umbrella-derived viruses have killed additional populations. The exact number is unknowable because many outbreaks occurred in regions without infrastructure to document casualties accurately. These deaths were not accidents. They were the predictable outcome of developing biological weapons designed to kill humans and testing those weapons on human populations. Umbrella knew the viruses were lethal. The lethality was the product's primary feature. The deaths were the mechanism through which the product functioned. Calling them accidents obscures that Umbrella deliberately created weapons meant to cause exactly these outcomes. The language matters. Describing outbreaks as accidents implies lack of intent, suggests that proper precautions could have prevented them, frames the harm as deviation from normal operations rather than consequence of normal operations. Umbrella's normal operations were weapons development. Weapons are designed to cause harm. The harm was intended. The scale might have exceeded projections, but the nature of the harm was exactly what Umbrella designed their products to accomplish. This connects to how we discuss civilian casualties in military contexts. When military operations kill civilians, the deaths are often described as collateral damage. The language implies the deaths were unintended side effects of operations directed at legitimate military targets. But when military planners know that certain operations will kill civilians and proceed anyway, calling those deaths collateral damage obscures that the deaths were accepted costs of pursuing military objectives. The civilians were deemed expendable relative to strategic goals. Umbrella's test subjects were expendable relative to profit goals. Raccoon City residents were expendable relative to data collection goals. Populations affected by bioterrorism were expendable relative to black market profits from virus sales. The deaths were built into the business model. They were not bugs in the system, they were features. Consider what this means about how capitalism values human life. Under capitalism, value is measured through market price. Human life has market value only insofar as it generates productive labor or consumer demand. People who cannot produce or consume have no market value. They are economically invisible. Systems that prioritize market value will treat economically invisible populations as expendable. Umbrella's test subjects were primarily people from marginalized communities, children from orphanages and foster systems, residents of Raccoon City, a small American city with limited political influence, populations in West Africa and other regions where Umbrella operated with minimal oversight. These populations had limited market value from Umbrella's perspective. Their lives could be sacrificed to generate products that would be sold to military buyers with enormous budgets. The market incentivized this calculus. Developing bioweapons cost money. Testing those weapons on populations with political power would create legal and reputational costs that exceeded development costs. Testing on populations without political power avoided those costs. Rational profit-maximizing behavior meant testing on whoever could be harmed with minimal consequences. The market rewarded extracting value from populations that could not defend themselves. This is not unique to bioweapons. The global supply chain depends on labor performed by people who cannot demand wages comparable to what workers in wealthy nations receive. Factories in developing nations produce consumer goods sold in developed nations. The price difference between production cost and retail price generates profit. Maintaining that profit margin requires keeping production costs low, which requires keeping wages low, which requires workers who lack power to demand higher wages. When factory collapses kill workers, as happened in Rana Plaza in Bangladesh in 2013 when over 1,000 garment workers died, corporations that sourced products from that factory express sympathy and promise improvements, but the structural incentives remain. Corporations that externalize safety costs onto workers compete more effectively than corporations that internalize those costs through better working conditions. The market rewards treating workers as expendable. Umbrella treated test subjects as expendable in precisely this way. The corporation could have developed bioweapons through consensual trials with proper safety protocols. This would have cost more money and taken more time. Corporations that cut costs compete more effectively than corporations that prioritize ethics. Umbrella cut costs by using test subjects who could not refuse, and by skipping safety protocols that would have slowed development. The market rewarded this behavior through military contracts worth billions. The fact that this behavior eventually destroyed Umbrella does not change the incentive structure. Umbrella collapsed because public exposure damaged its market position, not because market mechanisms punished unethical behavior. If Umbrella had maintained operational security, if Raccoon City had been successfully contained without public awareness, if STAR's survivors had been eliminated before they could testify, Umbrella would have continued operating profitably. The market does not punish unethical behavior that remains hidden. It only punishes behavior that becomes public enough to threaten profits. This reveals a fundamental problem with relying on markets to regulate corporate behavior. Markets respond to information that affects prices. If harm is successfully externalized, so it does not affect corporate prices, markets have no mechanism to address that harm. A corporation that can hide harm, that can externalize costs onto populations without market power, that can use legal and political influence to prevent accountability, will be rewarded by markets for doing so. Umbrella successfully hid harm for decades. The Wesker children disappeared without investigation. The mansion incident was suppressed. Raccoon City was blamed on industrial accident. Spencer's death in 2006 and Umbrella's collapse in 2004 prevented full accountability from ever occurring. The corporation was never prosecuted for human experimentation, for the Raccoon City outbreak, for decades of illegal bioweapons development. Individual researchers were never held accountable for experiments they conducted. Military buyers who contracted with Umbrella for bioweapons were never questioned about their complicity in funding illegal research. The system protected itself. Prosecuting Umbrella would have required prosecuting government officials who approved contracts with Umbrella. It would have required exposing classified bioweapons programs. It would have required admitting that regulatory oversight had failed for decades. Institutions protect themselves by avoiding accountability even when accountability is necessary for justice. Chapter 10: The Pharmaceutical Complex. The global pharmaceutical industry generated over $1 trillion in revenue in 2019. The 10 largest pharmaceutical corporations reported combined profits exceeding $100 billion that year. These companies develop medications that save lives, treat chronic conditions, and alleviate suffering for millions of people. They also operate within market structures that create perverse incentives directly parallel to Umbrella's business model. Drug development costs money. Bringing a new medication to market requires research, clinical trials, regulatory approval, manufacturing infrastructure, and distribution networks. Pharmaceutical companies claim development costs justify high drug prices, but the pricing models reveal something more complex than cost recovery. Companies charge whatever the market will bear. Medications for rare diseases command premium prices because patients have no alternatives. Insulin prices in the United States increased over 300% between 2002 and 2013, despite insulin being a century-old medication with minimal development costs remaining. The pricing is not determined by development cost. It is determined by how much suffering people will endure before they can no longer pay. A diabetic who needs insulin to survive will pay everything they have before accepting death. The pharmaceutical company knows this. The price reflects maximum extraction from people who cannot refuse. This is profit-maximizing behavior that treats human desperation as a revenue opportunity. Umbrella's business model was structurally identical. Develop products people cannot refuse. Charge maximum price, extract value from populations with no alternatives. For Umbrella, the customers were militaries seeking bioweapons rather than patients seeking medicine, but the underlying logic was identical. Find populations that need what you sell, make them pay whatever you demand, externalize the costs of development and production onto whoever lacks power to refuse. Clinical trials demonstrate this most clearly. Pharmaceutical companies need test subjects to prove medications work and identify side effects. Conducting trials in wealthy nations with strong regulatory oversight is expensive. Subjects can demand compensation. Regulations require extensive safety protocols. Liability costs are high if something goes wrong. Companies respond by conducting trials in developing nations where regulations are weaker, where subjects are desperate enough to participate for minimal compensation, where liability costs are minimal because legal systems lack capacity to hold foreign corporations accountable. Between 1996 and 2006, Pfizer conducted trials of the antibiotic Trovan in Kano, Nigeria during a meningitis outbreak. Approximately 200 children participated. The trial proceeded without proper informed consent. Parents were not told their children were receiving an experimental medication rather than established treatment. 11 children died. Many others developed serious complications. Pfizer faced lawsuits. The company settled for $75 million, a fraction of what comparable harm would have cost in the United States. This is human experimentation on vulnerable populations justified through market logic. The children in Kano had no power to refuse. Their parents were not given information necessary to provide informed consent. The trial proceeded because it benefited Pfizer's development timeline and because Nigerian regulatory infrastructure could not prevent it. When harm occurred, the costs were borne by Nigerian families, while profits from Trovan went to Pfizer shareholders. The pattern repeats across pharmaceutical industry. AstraZeneca conducted trials in India that resulted in deaths and injuries among subjects who did not fully understand what they were participating in. GlaxoSmithKline conducted trials in Argentina on infants using a pneumonia vaccine. Parents reported being pressured to enroll their children. 14 children died during the trial. The company claimed the deaths were unrelated to the vaccine. Investigations revealed consent forms were forged and parents had not received full information about risks. These are not isolated incidents. They represent systematic practice within an industry that can profit from experimentation on populations without power to refuse. The same market logic that drove Umbrella to test bioweapons on Raccoon City residents drives pharmaceutical companies to test medications on populations in developing nations, find subjects who cannot refuse, extract data, externalize costs, profit from results. Umbrella's experimentation was more extreme in scale and brutality, but the fundamental mechanism was identical. Both Umbrella and legitimate pharmaceutical corporations operate in markets that reward extracting value from vulnerable populations while externalizing costs onto those populations. Both use scientific progress as justification for experiments that would not be permitted on populations with institutional protection. Both rely on regulatory capture and jurisdictional arbitrage to avoid accountability. The difference is degree rather than kind. Umbrella deliberately created lethal viruses and tested them on unwilling subjects, with the goal of weaponizing those viruses. Pharmaceutical companies create potentially beneficial medications and test them on subjects with questionable consent to prove efficacy and safety. Umbrella killed subjects intentionally. Pharmaceutical companies kill subjects negligently. Both externalize death onto populations deemed expendable. Patent law demonstrates how pharmaceutical markets create artificial scarcity to maximize profits. When companies develop new medications, they receive patent protection that prevents competitors from producing generic versions for 20 years. This monopoly allows companies to charge premium prices without market competition. Generic medications cost a fraction of patented versions because generic manufacturers only need to cover production costs, not development costs plus monopoly rents. The justification for patent protection is that it incentivizes research and development. Companies will not invest in developing new medications if competitors can immediately copy and sell the results. This is economically rational within capitalist frameworks, but it creates situations where people die from treatable conditions because they cannot afford patented medications that cost pennies to produce but sell for hundreds or thousands of dollars. South Africa faced this during the HIV/AIDS crisis in the late 1990s. Antiretroviral medications could manage HIV infection and prevent progression to AIDS. Pharmaceutical companies held patents on these medications and charged prices that made them inaccessible to most South Africans with HIV. The South African government attempted to allow generic production or importation of generic versions from India where patent law was different. Pharmaceutical companies sued, arguing that South African law violated international patent agreements. Approximately 5 million South Africans were HIV positive at the time. The patented medications could have saved millions of lives. The pharmaceutical companies prioritized protecting patent monopolies over saving those lives. Eventually, public pressure forced the companies to drop their lawsuit and negotiate lower prices. But the initial response was to use legal mechanisms to prevent access to life-saving medications in order to protect profit margins. This is market logic, prioritizing property rights over human life. The medications existed. The generic production capacity existed. The people dying from HIV needed access. But patent law created artificial scarcity that prevented access because protecting pharmaceutical profits took precedence over preventing deaths. The market was functioning as designed. The deaths were acceptable costs of maintaining patent monopolies. Umbrella used similar legal mechanisms to protect proprietary virus research. The T-virus was intellectual property owned by Umbrella Corporation. Competitors could not legally replicate or sell T-virus variants without licensing agreements. This monopoly position allowed Umbrella to charge premium prices to military buyers. When Umbrella collapsed and research entered black markets, the patent protections became irrelevant because black market operators do not respect intellectual property law. But during Umbrella's operation, legal monopoly on bioweapons research was a significant profit driver. The parallel extends to how industries suppress information about harm their products cause. Tobacco companies knew cigarettes caused cancer decades before admitting it publicly. Internal research documented the health risks. Companies suppressed that research, funded contrary studies, and created public confusion about whether smoking actually caused cancer. The strategy was designed to delay regulation and maintain sales while people continued dying from lung cancer. Pharmaceutical companies use similar tactics when medications cause unexpected harm. Merck's painkiller Vioxx was linked to heart attacks and strokes. Internal research suggested these risks years before the medication was withdrawn from market. The company downplayed the risks to maintain sales. An estimated 60,000 people died from Vioxx-related cardiovascular events before the medication was pulled. Merck paid billions in settlements but faced no criminal prosecution. Purdue Pharma knew OxyContin was highly addictive. Internal documents show the company understood the addiction risks and deliberately marketed the medication as less addictive than it actually was. The marketing drove prescription rates that fueled the opioid crisis. Hundreds of thousands of people died from opioid overdoses. Purdue Pharma filed for bankruptcy and restructured. The Sackler family that owned Purdue extracted billions in profits before the crisis became undeniable. They paid settlements but maintained enormous personal wealth derived from the crisis. These examples demonstrate that suppressing information about harm is rational profit-maximizing behavior when the costs of suppression are lower than the costs of acknowledging harm. Tobacco companies, pharmaceutical companies, and umbrella corporation all made the same calculation. Admitting that products cause death would reduce sales and create legal liability. Suppressing information about death maintains sales and delays liability. The market rewards suppression. Umbrella suppressed information about outbreaks, about experimentation, about bioweapons development for decades. The corporation used control over regulatory institutions, media influence, and legal threats to prevent information from reaching populations that would be harmed. When information did leak through STARS survivors, Umbrella used its institutional power to discredit those survivors and prevent investigation. This was not aberrant behavior. This was standard corporate risk management. Chapter 11: Structural Violence. Structural violence is harm caused by social structures rather than by individual actors. When people die from preventable diseases because they cannot afford treatment, the deaths are caused by healthcare systems that prioritize profit over access. When people die from starvation while food supply chains distribute abundance to wealthy populations, the deaths are caused by economic systems that allocate resources through market mechanisms rather than through need. The violence is built into institutional arrangements that determine who lives and who dies based on market position, rather than on any moral claim to survival. Umbrella's operations were structurally violent at every level. The decision to extract Progenitor virus from West Africa was structurally violent because it treated Ndipaya territory as resources available for European extraction. The Wesker project was structurally violent because it treated children from marginalized communities as experimental subjects whose lives were worth less than data they could generate. The Raccoon City outbreak was structurally violent because it treated urban populations as acceptable losses for gathering combat data. The bioterrorism proliferation after Umbrella's collapse was structurally violent because market mechanisms distributed deadly technologies without regard for human consequences. None of this required Spencer or any individual Umbrella employee to be personally sadistic. The violence was embedded in institutional logic that prioritized profit over human welfare. Employees who questioned this logic were terminated or reassigned. Employees who embraced it advanced. The institution selected for people who could rationalize harm as necessary cost of business operations. Over time, the institution became staffed primarily by people who either believed the rationalizations or had learned to suppress ethical objections to maintain employment. This is how ordinary people participate in extraordinary harm. They do not wake up deciding to cause mass death. They go to work, follow procedures, meet performance metrics, and advance their careers. The procedures are designed to externalize harm onto populations the employee never meets. The performance metrics measure profit rather than human welfare. Advancement requires demonstrating willingness to prioritize institutional goals over ethical concerns. Gradually, the employee becomes integrated into systems that cause harm at scale, while their individual contribution seems too small to constitute meaningful responsibility. Hannah Arendt called this the banality of evil. Adolf Eichmann, who organized logistics for Nazi deportations to concentration camps, did not present as a monster during his trial. He presented as a bureaucrat who had followed orders, met quotas, and advanced his career. The harm was enormous, but Eichmann's participation felt mundane to him. He was optimizing transportation networks. The fact that optimization meant efficiently delivering people to death camps was someone else's responsibility. He just managed the trains. Umbrella researchers who experimented on test subjects were doing research, advancing science, meeting project deadlines. The fact that research meant torturing children was someone else's responsibility. They just collected data. Umbrella executives who approved bioweapon sales were closing deals, meeting quarterly targets, maximizing shareholder value. The fact that closing deals meant selling weapons designed to kill civilians was someone else's responsibility. They just managed contracts. This fragmentation of responsibility is how institutions commit harm that individuals would refuse to commit alone. Each person's contribution seems small. Each decision seems rational within local context. The cumulative effect is catastrophic, but no individual feels responsible for the totality. Responsibility is distributed across so many people that it becomes meaningless. Everyone was just doing their job. Structural violence persists because it is embedded in institutions that outlast individual actors. Spencer died, but Umbrella continued operating. Umbrella collapsed, but bioweapons research continued through other institutions. Defeating individual bad actors does not address structural problems, because structures reproduce the conditions that create bad actors. Changing structures requires changing the incentives, power dynamics, and resource distributions that determine how institutions function. Consider how this applies to climate change. Fossil fuel companies have known for decades that carbon emissions cause climate change. Internal research documented the risks. Companies suppressed research, funded climate denial, and lobbied against regulations that would reduce emissions. The strategy was designed to maintain fossil fuel sales while planetary systems destabilized. The harm will affect billions of people over centuries. No individual employee of a fossil fuel company caused climate change. Each employee made local decisions that seemed rational within their job function. Geologists found oil deposits. Engineers designed extraction infrastructure. Executives approved projects. Lobbyists influenced policy. Each action was small. The cumulative effect is existential threat to human civilization. This is structural violence at planetary scale. The institutions are functioning as designed. Markets reward extracting fossil fuels and externalizing climate costs onto populations that will suffer consequences decades or centuries later. Shareholders profit now. Future generations pay costs later. The structure incentivizes this temporal exploitation because future people have no market power to protect their interests. Umbrella's bioweapons development followed identical logic. Current generation profits from weapons sales. Future generations deal with bioterrorism proliferation and outbreak risks. The structure incentivized temporal exploitation because future people could not refuse being harmed. Spencer positioned himself as advancing human evolution. What he was actually doing was imposing catastrophic risks on all future humans to pursue his eugenic fantasies and generate quarterly profits. This reveals something fundamental about capitalist markets. Markets discount future costs relative to present profits. $1 earned today is worth more than $1 earned in 10 years because present dollars can be invested to generate returns. This discounting is economically rational within capitalist accounting, but it creates perverse incentives when applied to decisions with long-term consequences. A corporation deciding whether to prevent pollution can compare prevention costs now against damage costs later. If damage costs are in the future, discounting makes them less valuable than prevention costs in the present. Rational profit maximizing behavior means polluting now and accepting damage later. The corporation externalizes costs onto whoever suffers the damage while internalizing profits from avoiding prevention costs. Umbrella externalized outbreak risks onto future populations while internalizing bioweapons profits. The decision to develop viruses capable of destroying human civilization made economic sense within Umbrella's accounting framework because the profits were immediate and measurable, while the existential risks were distant and uncertain. Markets cannot price existential risks accurately because markets cease to function if civilization collapses. So market mechanisms consistently undervalue preventing collapse. This is why market-based solutions to existential risks consistently fail. Climate change, nuclear weapons, pandemic diseases, artificial intelligence, bioengineered pathogens, all of these pose existential risks. All of them are being addressed through market mechanisms that systematically undervalue prevention. Companies profit from activities that increase risks, while costs are externalized onto everyone who will suffer consequences if catastrophe occurs. Umbrella demonstrates what happens when this pattern runs unchecked. A corporation develops technologies capable of causing human extinction. The corporation profits from developing and selling those technologies. When catastrophe nearly occurs multiple times, the corporation's response is to gather more data and refine the products. When the corporation finally collapses, the technologies proliferate to other actors who continue pursuing the same pattern. The market never corrects because the market cannot price extinction risk accurately. Chapter 12. What Resident Evil Teaches Us. Resident Evil is not subtle about its critique. The games name the problem explicitly. Umbrella Corporation, a pharmaceutical company conducting illegal bioweapons research through human experimentation while maintaining a consumer-facing facade. The symbolism is clear. Corporations that present as beneficial to public health can simultaneously conduct activities that threaten human survival. The umbrella protects some people while excluding others. Those under the umbrella survive. Those outside die. The franchise consistently frames zombies as victims rather than threats. People infected with T-virus lose their humanity through no choice of their own. They become monsters because a corporation decided their lives were worth less than weapons development profits. The horror is not that zombies exist. The horror is that zombies exist because someone chose to create them for profit. This reframes traditional zombie narratives. Earlier zombie fiction from Romero onward used zombies as metaphor for mindless consumerism, for conformity, for losing individuality to mass culture. Resident Evil uses zombies as literal consequence of corporate exploitation. The victims are not abstract symbols. They are specific populations harmed by specific corporate decisions. Raccoon City residents, test subjects, Ndipaya people whose sacred flower was weaponized. The games make players complicit in this system by positioning them as survivors navigating corporate-created disasters. Players do not have the power to prevent outbreaks. They can only react to situations corporations have created. The best outcome is escape. Accountability never arrives. Umbrella faces no meaningful consequences until market forces make the corporation unviable. Even then, the punishment is bankruptcy, not justice. No executives are imprisoned. No researchers are prosecuted. The institution fails, but individuals escape with wealth and freedom intact. This reflects how accountability functions in actual capitalist systems. Corporations that cause catastrophic harm face financial penalties, not criminal prosecution. Individuals within those corporations are insulated from consequences through corporate structure. When corporations collapse, executives take golden parachutes. Shareholders lose stock value but maintain other assets. Workers lose employment. Communities lose economic base. The people who profited most from corporate operations suffer least from corporate failure. The Resident Evil games also show how survivors become isolated in their knowledge. STARS members survive the mansion but cannot convince authorities to investigate Umbrella. Their testimony is dismissed. They are discredited. They become conspiracy theorists in the eyes of institutions that have been purchased by the entity they are trying to expose. This is realistic. Whistleblowers who expose corporate wrongdoing typically face retaliation, job loss, and social isolation. Their evidence is dismissed. They are framed as disgruntled employees or attention seekers. The games demonstrate that individual heroism is insufficient to address institutional problems. Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine spend decades fighting bioterrorism. They save thousands of lives, but they cannot prevent bioweapons proliferation because the market incentives for bioweapons development remain intact. As long as militaries will pay for viral weapons, someone will develop and sell those weapons. Defeating individual corporations or individual terrorists does not address the structural conditions that create endless supply of both. This is the fundamental critique Resident Evil offers. Corporate capitalism creates incentives for developing technologies capable of destroying human civilization. The technologies are developed because markets reward developing them. The technologies proliferate because markets distribute them to whoever can pay. The harm is externalized onto populations without power to refuse. Individual resistance is heroic but insufficient. Structural change requires addressing the market mechanisms that reward catastrophic harm. The franchise also explores how eugenic ideology persists beyond individual believers. Spencer dies, but his ideology lives on through Wesker, through other researchers who adopted his framework, through institutions that were built on eugenic principles. Defeating Spencer does not defeat eugenics because eugenics is not one man's delusion. It is a systematic worldview with deep roots in Western science, philosophy, and political economy. Challenging it requires challenging the assumptions about human value that underlie capitalist markets. Those assumptions are that human value is measured through productivity and market participation. People who produce more are worth more. People who consume more are worth more. People who do neither have no market value and are economically invisible. Spencer took these assumptions to their logical extreme. People who survive viral infection demonstrate genetic superiority. People who die demonstrate genetic inferiority. The survivors are worth more. The deaths are evolutionary progress. This is market logic applied to biology. Competitive markets eliminate inefficient firms. Eugenic selection eliminates inefficient humans. Both systems claim to optimize outcomes through competition and elimination. Both systems externalize the costs of elimination onto those being eliminated. Both systems are defended as natural, inevitable, and ultimately beneficial, despite causing catastrophic harm to specific populations. Resident Evil asks whether we can build systems that do not require treating populations as expendable. Can we develop technologies without experimenting on vulnerable people? Can we distribute resources without creating hierarchies where some lives are worth more than others? Can we organize economies without externalizing costs onto populations without power to refuse? The games do not provide answers. They provide scenarios that make the questions unavoidable. Chapter 13. The Umbrella Never Fell. In Resident Evil Village, released in 2021, players learn that Umbrella's origins trace back even further than previously revealed. Oswell Spencer encountered a woman named Miranda decades before founding Umbrella. Miranda had discovered a fungal bioweapon called the mold in a Central European village. The mold granted extraordinary abilities to those who could survive infection. Miranda used it, trying to resurrect her dead daughter through bioengineering. Spencer was inspired by Miranda's research. He saw the mold as proof that biological agents could grant superhuman abilities. This inspired his search for the Progenitor virus in Africa. The fungus and the virus had similar properties. Both could alter human biology at fundamental level. Both killed most people they infected. Both granted power to survivors. Spencer wanted to combine them to create something more potent than either alone. This retcon adds depth to Spencer's ideology. He was not working in isolation. He was part of a network of researchers pursuing similar goals through similar methods. Miranda experimented on her own village, turning residents into monsters in pursuit of resurrecting her daughter. Spencer expanded this approach to global scale. The personal tragedy became industrial operation. The village became Raccoon City, became the world. The retcon also reveals that Umbrella's corporate logo came from Miranda's village. 4 noble houses ruled the village, each represented by a different symbol. The symbols combine to form the familiar four-petal shape Spencer adopted as his corporate insignia. Spencer adopted this as his corporate logo, paying homage to Miranda while appropriating imagery from the community her experiments had devastated. The logo is literal colonial extraction. Take the symbols from the colonized place, repurpose them to represent the colonizing institution. This matters because it demonstrates how colonial logic operates across generations and scales. Miranda colonized her own village, treating neighbors as test subjects for her grief-driven experiments. Spencer colonized Miranda's research, taking her methods and applying them globally through Umbrella Corporation. Both claimed to be advancing human capability. Both caused catastrophic harm to populations they deemed expendable. The scale expanded, but the pattern remained consistent. Resident Evil 9, Requiem, set for release in 2026, appears to continue this pattern. The game returns to Raccoon City decades after its destruction. The city has become a testing ground again, this time for an organization called The Connections. The organization has deployed bioweapons in the ruins to study how they interact with existing contamination. The city that was destroyed to contain Umbrella's viruses has become a laboratory for Umbrella's successors. This demonstrates that Umbrella never truly fell. The corporation collapsed, but the institutions, ideologies, and market mechanisms that enabled Umbrella persist. New organizations rise to fill the niche Umbrella occupied. The same technologies are developed, the same populations are exploited, the same arguments about progress and evolution justify the same catastrophic harm. The names change, the actors change, the structural violence continues. The connections, like Umbrella before them, operate through pharmaceutical facade while conducting bioweapons research. They recruit former Umbrella personnel. They use Umbrella's research as foundation for new developments. They target the same vulnerable populations for experimentation. They maintain the same corporate structures that insulate leadership from accountability. They are not repeating Umbrella's mistakes. They are implementing Umbrella's successful strategies while learning from Umbrella's failures. This is how institutional violence reproduces itself. When an institution collapses, its practices, knowledge, and personnel do not disappear. They migrate to new institutions. The diaspora spreads what worked while abandoning what failed. Umbrella's bioweapons research worked. It generated enormous profits for decades. The failure was operational security, not business model. Subsequent organizations learned to maintain better secrecy while pursuing the same activities. This pattern appears across industries. When tobacco companies faced regulation in Western markets, they expanded into developing nations with weaker regulations. When pharmaceutical companies faced liability costs in wealthy nations, they shifted clinical trials to poor nations with less oversight. When financial firms caused the 2008 crisis, they restructured and rebranded while maintaining the practices that caused the crisis. Institutional failure rarely prevents institutional practice from continuing through successor organizations. The Resident Evil franchise has traced this pattern for 3 decades. Umbrella falls, the viruses spread, new organizations emerge, the threat escalates, individual heroes fight admirably but cannot address root causes. The cycle continues because the structural conditions that create bioweapons corporations remain unchanged. Markets still reward developing deadly technologies. Regulations still fail to prevent corporate harm. Populations still lack power to refuse being experimented on. This is the franchise's most persistent and depressing insight. Defeating individual bad actors does not solve structural problems. Umbrella could be destroyed completely, every employee prosecuted, every asset seized, and the bioweapons industry would continue through other corporations using other names. The problem is not that one corporation behaved unethically. The problem is that markets incentivize unethical behavior and institutional structures enable it at scale. Chapter 14: The Real Horror. The real horror in Resident Evil is not zombies. It is the recognition that populations can be transformed into resources and processed through institutional machinery designed to extract value from their suffering. The transformation does not require supernatural intervention. It requires market mechanisms that treat human life as cost to be minimized, and corporate structures that enable systematic harm while fragmenting responsibility. Zombies are victims who have been reduced to their basest biological functions: hunger, aggression, movement without consciousness. They represent what happens when everything that makes someone human is stripped away until only the mechanisms of consumption remain. This is literally what T-virus does to infected people. It destroys cognitive function, eliminates personality, reduces them to bodies driven by appetite. But this is also metaphorically what capitalism does to populations it exploits. Workers are reduced to labor units measured by productive output. Consumers are reduced to revenue sources measured by purchasing capacity. Test subjects are reduced to data generators measured by experimental utility. The reduction removes individuality, agency, and moral standing. What remains is raw material to be processed. The franchise consistently shows that this reduction happens before infection. The Wesker children were treated as raw materials for eugenics experiments before they were infected. They were selected, acquired, processed, and infected according to protocols designed to maximize data generation. The infection completed a process of dehumanization that began when Umbrella identified them as suitable subjects. Raccoon City residents were treated as raw materials for combat data collection before the outbreak. Umbrella shaped the city's economy, controlled its institutions, and monitored its population in preparation for eventual use as test subjects. When the outbreak occurred, Umbrella did not evacuate residents. The corporation observed them, gathered data on transmission rates and weapon effectiveness, and allowed over 100,000 people to die in what was essentially a field test of bioweapons against civilian populations. The Ndipaya were treated as obstacles to resource extraction before any virus was deployed. Their protection of the progenitor flower was dismissed as primitive superstition. Their resistance was suppressed through violence. Their territory was occupied and transformed into extraction site. The flower was removed from its cultural and ecological context and processed into weapons. Everything that made the flower significant to the Ndipaya was stripped away until only commercial value remained. This pattern of reduction and extraction is the core horror the franchise explores. The zombies are the end result of a process that begins with categorizing populations as less valuable, continues through institutional mechanisms that enable exploitation, and concludes with literal transformation of people into monsters. The transformation is shocking when zombies appear on screen, but the truly horrifying transformation is the one that happens in boardrooms and laboratories where people become line items in corporate accounting. Resident Evil asks us to recognize ourselves in this machinery, not as heroes fighting zombies, as people who participate in systems that reduce other people to resources. We buy products from companies that use exploitative labor practices. We invest in funds that include stocks from corporations with catastrophic environmental or human rights records. We pay taxes that fund military operations that kill civilians in other countries. We benefit from pharmaceutical research conducted on vulnerable populations. We are integrated into institutional machinery that causes harm at scales we cannot fully comprehend. The game suggests that recognizing this complicity is a necessary first step toward changing it. Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine cannot prevent bioterrorism alone. They need institutional support, international cooperation, and structural change that addresses market incentives for bioweapons development. Individual heroism is necessary but insufficient. Collective institutional transformation is required, but the games also show how difficult institutional transformation is. The BSAA, formed to combat bioterrorism, eventually becomes corrupted. By Resident Evil Village, the BSAA is deploying bioorganic weapons as soldiers, using the same technologies they were created to combat. The institution founded to address bioweapons proliferation has become another vector for it. This is not surprising. Institutions operating in markets that reward bioweapons development will eventually adopt those weapons themselves because competitive pressures incentivize it. This demonstrates why market-based solutions to market-generated problems consistently fail. An organization competing with bioweapon-equipped adversaries will deploy bioweapons to maintain competitive advantage. An organization competing with corporations that exploit cheap labor will exploit cheap labor to maintain competitive advantage. An organization competing with firms that externalize environmental costs will externalize those costs to maintain competitive advantage. Markets reward harmful behavior, so organizations that refuse to engage in that behavior are outcompeted by organizations that embrace it. Breaking this pattern requires changing the incentive structures that create it. This means regulating markets to prevent exploitation. It means restructuring institutions to prioritize human welfare over profit. It means building power for populations currently excluded from decision-making processes that affect their lives. It means acknowledging that some technologies should not be developed regardless of market demand. It means accepting that preventing catastrophe requires limiting what corporations can do, even when limiting them reduces profitability. Resident Evil does not provide blueprint for how to accomplish this. The games are horror, not political theory, but they make the necessity unavoidable. Either we transform institutions that treat populations as expendable resources, or those institutions will eventually process us through machinery we helped build. The zombies are not coming from outside. They are us, transformed by systems we participate in, reduced to our most basic functions, turned against each other in service of corporate profit. The franchise has spent 3 decades showing what happens when we fail to make that transformation. Cities burn, populations are devastated, the technologies proliferate, the cycle continues, individual heroes fight admirably, structural problems persist. The horror deepens not because situations get worse, but because we recognize the situations as preventable, as chosen, as consequence of prioritizing profit over human life again and again, until the choice becomes normalized and the horror becomes routine. This is the real lore of Resident Evil. Not the specific details of which virus does what, or which corporation developed which bioweapon. The real lore is the systematic demonstration of how capitalism transforms people into resources, how imperialism extracts value from populations without power to refuse, and how markets reward catastrophic harm when that harm can be externalized onto populations deemed expendable. The zombies are just the visual representation of what this process does to human beings. The real monster is the system that creates them. Chapter 15: The Logic of Extraction. Capitalism requires a simple equation to function. Someone owns the means of production. Someone else sells their labor to use those means of production. The owner pays the worker less than the value the worker produces. The difference is profit. This difference, which Karl Marx called surplus value, is the engine of capital accumulation. Everything else follows from this. The worker cannot refuse this arrangement. They do not own land to farm, tools to manufacture goods, or capital to start enterprises. They must sell their labor to survive. The owner can refuse. They have options. They can invest capital elsewhere, hire different workers, or wait for labor prices to drop. The asymmetry creates a market where workers compete with each other for employment, while owners extract maximum value from whoever accepts the lowest wage. This is not conspiracy. This is how labor markets function when ownership is concentrated. Workers who demand higher wages are replaced by workers desperate enough to accept less. Workers who organize for better conditions are fired and replaced by workers who cannot afford to organize. Workers who resist exploitation are eliminated from the labor pool and replaced by workers who have learned that resistance means starvation. The system selects for compliance through economic pressure. Umbrella operated on this exact logic. The corporation owned laboratories, manufacturing facilities, distribution networks, and intellectual property. Workers sold their labor to Umbrella because they needed employment. Umbrella paid them wages while extracting far more value from their work. A researcher paid $60,000 annually might generate millions in patent value through their discoveries. The difference flowed to Umbrella's shareholders. The researcher received subsistence. The shareholder received wealth. But Umbrella took this logic further than most corporations. The company did not just exploit workers through wage extraction. They exploited populations through direct experimentation. Test subjects were not employees. They were raw materials processed through research protocols. They received no compensation. They generated enormous value through the data their suffering produced. All of that value was captured by Umbrella. This is capitalism's logical endpoint. If workers can be exploited through wage theft, why not exploit non-workers through direct extraction? If markets reward minimizing labor costs, why not eliminate labor costs entirely by using subjects who cannot demand payment? If competitive advantage comes from externalizing costs onto populations without power to refuse, why not find populations with zero power and externalize total costs onto them? Marx described how capitalism transforms everything into commodities. Land becomes real estate, water becomes beverage products, human relationships become transactions. The transformation reduces complex systems to exchange values that can be bought and sold. Use value, what something actually does for people, becomes subordinate to exchange value, what something can be sold for in markets. Umbrella commodified human biology itself. Bodies became sources of viral samples. Children became test subjects for eugenics experiments. Cities became laboratories for weapons testing. The use value of these things, what they meant to the people involved, was irrelevant. A child's use value to their family meant nothing compared to their exchange value as experimental subject. A city's use value to its residents meant nothing compared to its exchange value as testing ground. This commodification requires treating people as things. Marx called this alienation. Workers become alienated from the products they create because those products belong to owners. Workers become alienated from the labor process because they have no control over how work is organized. Workers become alienated from other workers because they compete for employment. Workers become alienated from their own humanity because their value is reduced to productive capacity. Umbrella's test subjects experienced total alienation. They were alienated from their bodies, which became property of researchers. They were alienated from their suffering, which became data in corporate databases. They were alienated from other subjects who were competitors in survival rather than fellow humans. They were alienated from their humanity entirely, reduced to biological material to be processed. The Wesker children exemplify this. They were selected for genetic characteristics that made them valuable experimental subjects. They were separated from families and communities that gave them identity beyond genetic profiles. They were educated in ideologies that justified their treatment as special rather than exploited. They were infected with viruses that either killed them or transformed them into weapons. Everything about their existence was shaped by their commodity status within Project W. Albert Wesker survived and gained superhuman abilities, but those abilities did not liberate him from commodity status. They made him more valuable to Umbrella. His enhanced capabilities were not his own. They belonged to the research program that created them. He was intellectual property. When he tried to claim autonomy, when he tried to pursue his own goals rather than Umbrella's, he became a rogue asset to be eliminated. This is alienation at its most complete. Wesker could not even claim ownership of his own body because his body was the product of corporate research. His strength, his intelligence, his regenerative abilities, all of it was created through Umbrella's investment. From a capitalist perspective, Umbrella owned those enhancements the same way a factory owner owns products manufactured in their facility using their equipment. Marx argued that capitalism creates what he called the reserve army of labor. This is the population of unemployed workers who compete with employed workers for jobs. The reserve army keeps wages low because employed workers know they can be replaced. When workers demand higher pay, owners can threaten to hire from the reserve army instead. The threat of unemployment disciplines workers into accepting exploitation. Umbrella expanded this concept to populations outside the labor market entirely. The Ndipaya people, Raccoon City residents, orphan children, populations in regions where Umbrella operated with minimal oversight. These were not workers Umbrella employed. They were reserve populations available for extraction when Umbrella needed test subjects, extraction sites, or experimental data. Their vulnerability made them valuable in the same way unemployed workers are valuable to employers. They could be exploited without resistance. This reveals how capitalism requires populations at the margins who can be drawn into production processes when profitable and discarded when convenient. The system needs people who are desperate enough to accept any terms offered, because refusal means death. Umbrella formalized this by literally killing people who could not provide value through experimentation. The test subjects who died from progenitor infection were discarded. The survivors became assets. The selection process was capitalism's normal logic accelerated to biological timescales. Marx also identified how capitalism concentrates wealth over time. Owners accumulate capital through surplus value extraction. Accumulated capital purchases more means of production, which enables more surplus extraction, which generates more capital. The process is self-reinforcing. Wealth concentrates in fewer hands, while workers receive only enough to survive and continue working. Spencer embodied this perfectly. He started with inherited aristocratic wealth. He used that wealth to fund the African expedition that discovered progenitor virus. He used the virus to found Umbrella Corporation. He used Umbrella to extract value from workers, test subjects, and entire populations. The extracted value concentrated in Spencer's hands and his shareholders' portfolios. By the time Spencer was killed, he controlled a multinational empire built on systematic exploitation of everyone without his class position. The concentration of wealth gave Spencer power to shape institutions. He purchased police departments, regulatory agencies, politicians, and media outlets. This power allowed him to conduct illegal experiments without accountability. When STAR's survivors tried to expose Umbrella, institutional power Spencer had purchased suppressed their evidence. The concentration of economic power became concentration of political power, which enabled further economic extraction without constraint. This is how capitalism undermines democracy. When wealth concentrates sufficiently, wealthy individuals and corporations can purchase political influence that allows them to rewrite rules in their favor. Regulations that would constrain exploitation are prevented or repealed. Enforcement agencies are captured. Democratic institutions become mechanisms for wealthy interests to legitimize their dominance. The population can vote, but voting does not matter when all viable candidates are funded by same corporate interests. Raccoon City demonstrated this. The city was nominally democratic. Citizens voted for mayor and city council, but Umbrella funded the campaigns. Umbrella employed significant portions of the workforce. Umbrella's economic power meant democratic institutions served Umbrella's interests rather than citizens' welfare. When the outbreak occurred, the democratic structures could not protect citizens because those structures had been purchased. Marx predicted that capitalism would create crises of overproduction. Capitalists compete with each other by producing more goods at lower costs. This competition leads to producing more than markets can absorb. When goods cannot be sold, production halts, workers are fired, and economic crisis follows. The crisis destroys capital, and workers suffer unemployment until production restarts at lower capacity. Umbrella experienced a different kind of crisis. The corporation produced bioweapons beyond what markets could safely absorb. Raccoon City was overproduction crisis made literal. Too many viruses, too many test subjects, too many experiments conducted with too little containment. The production exceeded Umbrella's capacity to control it. The outbreak destroyed the corporation's market position and forced bankruptcy. But the crisis did not destroy the bioweapons themselves. Those proliferated to black markets where demand remained high. This is capitalism's typical response to overproduction crisis. Destroy the institutions that created excess capacity while distributing the products to wherever markets still exist. The bioweapons did not disappear when Umbrella collapsed. They spread to more actors operating with less oversight, making the problem worse rather than better. The underlying contradiction Marx identified is that capitalism requires constant growth, but operates in a finite world. Resources are limited. Markets are limited. The planet's capacity to absorb pollution and environmental damage is limited. Yet capitalism demands endless accumulation. Each crisis is resolved by finding new markets to exploit, new resources to extract, new populations to commodify. Eventually, the system runs out of frontiers. Umbrella reached this limit by developing viruses capable of destroying human civilization. There was no frontier beyond that, no new markets to expand into when your product threatens to kill all potential customers. The corporation had pushed extraction logic to its absolute extreme. Create weapons that can end humanity. Sell them to militaries willing to risk human extinction for strategic advantage. Externalize the existential risk onto everyone. This is where capitalism's growth imperative leads when unconstrained. Environmental destruction threatens civilization. Nuclear weapons threaten civilization. Bioengineered pandemics threaten civilization. Artificial intelligence might threaten civilization. All of these are products of systems that reward developing potentially catastrophic technologies because the profits are privatized while the risks are socialized. The owners capture gains. Everyone bears the costs if catastrophe occurs. Umbrella made this logic visible by making the threat immediate and personal. Zombies are not abstract systemic risk. They are people you knew transformed into monsters trying to kill you. The horror is visceral. But the horror is just visualization of what capitalism does constantly at scales too large to comprehend emotionally. The system transforms people into commodities, extracts their value, discards them when extraction is complete, and distributes the costs of extraction onto populations without power to refuse. The solution Marx proposed was collective ownership of the means of production. If workers controlled factories, laboratories, and corporations democratically, they could not exploit themselves. Surplus value would be distributed among those who created it rather than concentrated in owners' hands. Production would be organized to meet human needs rather than to maximize profit. The incentive to externalize costs would disappear because the people bearing costs would be the same people making decisions. Resident Evil does not advocate this solution explicitly, but the games demonstrate repeatedly that private ownership of catastrophically dangerous technologies leads to catastrophe. Umbrella, the Connections, and every other corporation in the franchise causes disasters because their institutional structure prioritizes profit over human survival. The disasters are not accidents, they are predictable outcomes of organizing dangerous research through institutions designed to maximize shareholder value. The alternative would be democratic control over research that poses existential risks. Populations that would bear the costs of bioweapons deployment should decide whether bioweapons are developed. Communities that would suffer from viral outbreaks should decide whether viral research proceeds. Workers who conduct experiments should control whether those experiments serve human welfare or corporate profit. This would not eliminate all risk, but it would eliminate the specific risks created by prioritizing profit over survival. The games show this alternative is possible through the BSAA and similar organizations. These are publicly funded institutions with democratic accountability tasked with protecting populations from bioterrorism. They are imperfect and eventually become corrupted, but they represent an attempt to address bioweapons through collective action rather than through market mechanisms. The fact that they struggle demonstrates how difficult it is to build institutions that resist corruption when operating in capitalist contexts. Marx's fundamental insight was that class conflict is inevitable under capitalism. Owners and workers have opposed interests. Owners want to minimize wages and maximize surplus extraction. Workers want to maximize wages and minimize exploitation. The conflict cannot be resolved within capitalism because the system requires exploitation to function. Either workers gain enough power to transform the system, or owners maintain enough power to prevent transformation. Umbrella's relationship with every population it exploited was class conflict in its rawest form. Spencer and shareholders versus test subjects. Umbrella executives versus Raccoon City residents. Corporate interests versus human survival. The conflicts were not resolved through negotiation or compromise. They were resolved through violence. Umbrella used violence to suppress resistance. Survivors used violence to destroy Umbrella. The system created antagonisms that could only be addressed through force. This is capitalism stripped of its legitimating narratives. No social contract, no mutual benefit, no rising tide lifting all boats. Just owners extracting value from populations without power to refuse, using violence when extraction is resisted, externalizing costs until the system collapses under its own contradictions. Umbrella is not aberration. Umbrella is clarity. The corporation shows what capitalism is when you remove the facade.